The sound of the gray forest. The interior of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state is defined by its density and a specific type of silence that carries a heavy weight. In the early 1990s, a small group of experienced forestry surveyors and environmental researchers began documenting a series of sensory anomalies in a remote drainage basin located several miles from any maintained trailheads. The area was characterized by old-growth cedar and hemlock trees that blocked out a significant portion of the daylight, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor even during the height of summer. These professionals were accustomed to the isolation of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, but the reports coming out of this specific sector began to deviate from the standard challenges of fieldwork. It started with the persistent feeling of being watched from the tree line, a common psychological reaction to deep woods environments, but it quickly evolved into something more structurally organized and difficult to dismiss as mere isolation-induced anxiety. One surveyor, who had spent over a decade mapping remote sections of the Cascades and the Olympics, noted in his logs that the wildlife in the drainage basin seemed to disappear entirely once the sun dipped below the surrounding ridges. Usually, a forest of that size and health would be loud with the sounds of nocturnal insects, owls, and small mammals. Instead, the team described a vacuum of sound that felt unnatural. When they spoke to one another, their voices did not seem to carry. The sound would drop off just a few feet away from the speaker, as if the air itself was too thick to transmit vibrations. This acoustic dead zone became the primary focus of their private discussions at camp, as it interfered with their ability to coordinate their movements across the rugged terrain. They began to refer to the phenomenon as the gray blanket, describing how the fog and the silence seemed to work together to isolate each individual even when they were within sight of their colleagues. By the third week of the expedition, the reported experiences shifted from passive environmental oddities to active sensory disturbances. Multiple members of the team began reporting the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to originate from directly behind them. Whenever they turned to identify the source, there was nothing but the swaying branches of the hemlocks. This was not the quick, frantic breathing of a startled animal, but a slow, methodical respiration that matched the pace of a large lung capacity. One researcher recorded in his field notes that he stopped walking to tie his boot and heard the breathing stop exactly 2 seconds after he did. When he resumed his pace, the sound resumed. He tested this several times, finding that the auditory mimicry was nearly perfect, but always slightly delayed, suggesting a conscious attempt to mirror his movements rather than a natural echo or an environmental fluke. The psychological strain on the crew became evident as the days progressed. They were not dealing with a threat they could see or a predator they could track. There were no tracks left in the soft moss, no broken branches, and no hair caught on the bark of the trees. The terrain remained undisturbed, yet the sensation of a physical presence was so overwhelming that several team members refused to leave the immediate perimeter of the base camp alone. They began to experience a shared perception of a tall, thin silhouette that would stand at the edge of their lantern light at night. This figure never moved or made a sound. It was described as being slightly darker than the surrounding night, a void in the shape of a human that lacked any discernible features. When they shone their high-powered flashlights toward the spot where they saw the shape, the beams would cut through the mist and reveal nothing but empty space between the trees. As the team moved deeper into the basin to complete their surveys, the time distortion began. This is a phenomenon often reported in high-strung survival situations, but the consistency among the different team members was what made this case stand out in local regional records. On one particular Tuesday, 2 surveyors left camp at 7 in the morning to mark a boundary line less than half a mile away. They estimated the task would take 2 hours at most. According to their watches and their internal sense of time, they performed the work and returned to camp in what felt like the expected duration. However, when they arrived back at the base, they found their colleagues in a state of panic. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon. The two men had been gone for 9 hours, but they had no memory of the missing 7 hours. They had not eaten their packed lunches, and they did not feel particularly hungry or tired, yet the sun was already beginning to set behind the western peaks. The lack of physical evidence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect for the researchers. They were trained to look at the world through a lens of data and tangible proof. They set up motion-activated cameras around the camp to catch whatever was stalking them. When they checked the film later, the cameras had been triggered dozens of times throughout the night. Every single frame was blank, showing only the empty forest floor or the trunks of the trees. There was no technical malfunction found with the equipment. It appeared as though something was triggering the sensors but remained invisible to the camera lens. This led to a theory among the crew that the phenomenon was not a biological entity at all, but some kind of localized electromagnetic or atmospheric anomaly that was playing tricks on their nervous systems and their electronic gear. One evening, the entire group experienced a collective auditory event that ended their desire to remain in the basin. They were sitting around a small stove, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, when a sound like a heavy metallic lid being slammed shut echoed through the valley. It was followed by a series of vocalizations that sounded like human speech played backward and at half speed. The sounds did not come from a single direction. They seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. The team described the feeling as a low-frequency hum that made their teeth ache and caused a deep sense of dread in their chests. It lasted for approximately 3 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving them in that same heavy, suffocating silence they had grown to fear. There was no wind that night, and there were no industrial operations or low-flying aircraft within 50 miles of their location. The following morning, the decision was made to break camp and head back to the trailhead early. The retreat was marked by a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. As they packed their gear, they found that several items had been moved. Their heavy sample bags, which had been neatly stacked the night before, were now scattered in a wide circle around the campsite. Nothing was missing and nothing was damaged, but the bags had been relocated with a precision that seemed intentional. The heaviest bags weighed over 60 pounds, and moving them would have required significant effort, yet no one had heard a sound during the night. The moss on the ground where the bags had been dragged showed no signs of disturbance, as if they had been lifted and placed down rather than pulled across the surface. During the hike out, the lead surveyor reported seeing a man standing in a thicket of ferns about 50 yards off the trail. The man was dressed in clothing that appeared to be from the 1920s, consisting of a heavy wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He was standing perfectly still, looking away from the trail. The surveyor called out to him, thinking it might be a lost hiker or a local resident, but the man did not respond. When the surveyor stepped off the trail to get a closer look, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the trees. It didn't run or hide, it simply ceased to be visible as the light shifted. The rest of the team, who were only a few paces behind, saw nothing but the ferns. This incident further cemented the idea that the environment itself was projecting images or memories that had no place in the present moment. When the group finally reached the trailhead and returned to their office in the city, they found it difficult to translate their experiences into an official report. How does a professional researcher explain that they were intimidated by a silence that felt like a physical weight, or that they lost 7 hours of their lives while walking a few hundred yards? The official documentation of the survey noted the geographic data and the soil samples they managed to collect, but the personal journals of the men involved told a much different story. They spoke of a place where the laws of physics and the boundaries of human perception seemed to blur. They spoke of a forest that felt less like a collection of trees and more like a single, massive consciousness that was aware of their presence and was slowly trying to incorporate them into its own distorted sense of time. In the years following the expedition, several members of the team returned to the Olympic Peninsula, but none of them would go back to that specific drainage basin. Local records from the area reveal a history of similar reports dating back to the late 19th century. Loggers in the 1890s wrote about the whistling trees that would sound like human voices calling out names in the dark. Native American oral traditions also warned of certain valleys in the interior that were avoided because they were considered places where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the unseen was dangerously thin. These stories were often dismissed as folklore or the results of cabin fever, but for the men who experienced the events in the 1990s, the fear was grounded in a very modern, very tangible reality. One of the most lingering effects of the encounter was the change in the team's perception of sound. Several members reported that for months after leaving the forest, they had difficulty sleeping in complete silence. They had grown so accustomed to the oppressive, artificial quiet of the basin that the normal sounds of a suburban neighborhood, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic felt abrasive and loud. Conversely, if they found themselves in a truly quiet room, they would start to hear that same rhythmic breathing they had heard in the woods. It was as if a part of their auditory processing had been permanently recalibrated by the environment they had stepped into. They were no longer able to trust their own ears, constantly questioning whether a sound was real or a lingering echo of the Olympic interior. The mystery of the missing time was never solved. No evidence of drug exposure, carbon monoxide poisoning, or shared delusional episodes could be found. The men were in peak physical and mental health prior to the trip. The equipment they used was calibrated and functioning correctly. The only common denominator was the location itself. Geologists have since looked into the area, noting that the specific mineral composition of the rock in that basin might create unusual magnetic variances, but nothing that would account for the level of sensory distortion reported by the witnesses. The magnetic theory also fails to explain the visual sightings or the organized movement of the heavy equipment. As the story of the survey team faded into local legend, it joined a long list of unexplained occurrences in the deep woods of the American Northwest. These are stories that don't involve monsters in the traditional sense, but rather a fundamental breakdown of what we consider to be reality. The forest remains there, a sprawling, indifferent expanse of green and gray. The drainage basin is still remote, rarely visited by anyone today. The trees continue to grow in the permanent twilight, and the silence remains as heavy as it was 30 years ago. For those who know where to look in the archives, the reports of the breathing woods and the missing hours serve as a quiet reminder that there are still pockets of the world where the human experience is not the dominant one. The psychological impact of the incident led one of the researchers to pursue a secondary career in acoustic ecology, trying to understand how soundscapes can influence human behavior and perception. He never found a perfect match for what he heard in the Olympics, but he did discover that certain low-frequency vibrations can induce feelings of paranoia and the sensation of being watched. However, he admitted that this scientific explanation didn't quite cover the visual elements or the synchronized loss of time. He remained convinced that while science could explain the symptoms, it couldn't explain the source. To him, the basin was a place where the environment was actively trying to communicate something, even if the human brain wasn't equipped to translate the message. The events are often cited in specialized circles as a classic example of an environmental haunting. Unlike a traditional haunting centered on a house or a grave, an environmental haunting is tied to the land itself. It is a recurring pattern of energy or perception that is triggered by specific conditions in the natural world. In this case, the combination of the dense canopy, the unique geography of the basin, and perhaps the specific weather patterns of the Olympic Peninsula created a perfect storm for a reality-bending experience. It suggests that our understanding of the wilderness is still very much on the surface, and that beneath the beauty of the national parks lies a layer of the world that is completely alien to us. The narrative of the Gray Forest serves as a cautionary tale for those who venture too far off the beaten path without respecting the power of the landscape. It isn't about the fear of a predator or the fear of getting lost. It is the fear of losing one's grip on the fundamental truths of existence. The men who walked into that basin were professionals who believed in maps, watches, and the reliability of their own senses. They walked out as men who understood that maps can be wrong, watches can skip hours, and senses can be manipulated by the very air they breathe. The unresolved tension of their story lies in that realization. The forest didn't attack them, it simply showed them that they didn't belong there, and that their presence was being tolerated by something much larger and much older than they could imagine. In the end, the records of the expedition were archived in a regional forestry library where they remain to this day. They are tucked between reports on soil acidity and timber yields, a strange and unsettling anomaly in a sea of dry data. Occasionally, a new researcher or a curious hiker will stumble upon the files and read about the breathing sounds and the missing hours. They might laugh it off as a joke or a product of the isolation, but if they ever find themselves in the deep interior of the Olympic Peninsula as the sun begins to set, they might find their thoughts returning to those old reports. They might find themselves listening a little more closely to the silence, and they might find themselves checking their watches a little more often, wondering if the time they are seeing is the same time the rest of the world is experiencing. The persistence of the gray blanket phenomenon suggests that these incidents are not isolated to a single decade or a single group of people. Rather, they are a part of the long-term history of the region. Every few years, a story emerges from the Olympics that mirrors the experiences of the 1990s team. A hiker reports hearing their own name called out by a voice that sounds exactly like their mother's. A camping group finds their tent moved 20 feet in the middle of the night without waking them. A photographer discovers a silhouette in the background of a shot that wasn't there when they pressed the shutter. These are the modern echoes of an ancient mystery, a set of experiences that defy classification and remain stubbornly outside the reach of conventional investigation. What makes this particular case so compelling is the lack of a definitive ending. There was no grand reveal, no confrontation, and no resolution. The team simply left, and the forest remained. This lack of closure is what keeps the story alive in the minds of those who study it. It forces us to confront the idea that some things in this world are not meant to be understood, they are simply meant to be witnessed. The Gray Forest is a place of witness, a location where the natural world performs a slow, silent drama that we can only catch glimpses of. It reminds us that for all our technology and our desire to map every inch of the planet, there are still places that remain dark, quiet, and fundamentally unknown. The surveyor who first noted the breathing sounds eventually retired to a small town on the coast, away from the heavy timber and the deep valleys. He spent his final years looking out at the ocean, an environment that he found much more honest than the forest. The ocean was dangerous, yes, but its dangers were visible and its sounds were consistent. It didn't mimic you, and it didn't steal your time. He rarely spoke about the 1990s expedition, but when he did, he always mentioned the same thing. He didn't care about what the thing in the woods was. He only cared that he had gotten out before the forest decided he was a part of it. His story, like the stories of the others, remains a testament to the unsettling power of the American wilderness and the thin line between reality and the unexplained. The geography of the Olympic Peninsula continues to shift as the years go by. New growth covers old trails, and landslides alter the shape of the valleys. The drainage basin where the events took place may look different today, but the core of the environment remains the same. It is a place of extreme moisture, extreme density, and extreme isolation. Those who study the area from a distance suggest that the specific combination of environmental factors there might never be fully replicated elsewhere, making it a unique laboratory for the strange. But for those who have been there, it is not a laboratory. It is a place where the air feels like a physical presence and where the silence has a heartbeat of its own. One detail that often gets overlooked in the archival reports is the state of the team's equipment months later. Several of the electronic devices that were used during the survey, handheld radios and GPS units, began to fail in strange ways. The radios would occasionally pick up low-frequency signals that sounded like heavy breathing even when they were turned off and the batteries were removed. The GPS units would sometimes display coordinates that didn't correspond to any location on Earth, showing the devices to be thousands of miles away or in the middle of the ocean. These technical glitches were dismissed as hardware degradation due to the moisture of the rainforest, but for the team members, it was a lingering reminder of the distorted reality they had inhabited. It was as if the equipment had been infected by the basin's logic, unable to function correctly in the normal world ever again. The legacy of the incident is found in the quiet conversations between park rangers and longtime residents of the peninsula. They know which areas to avoid during certain times of the year. They know that when the fog rolls in a certain way and the wind dies down completely, it's time to head back to the lowlands. They don't call it paranormal, and they don't call it a haunting. They just call it the way the woods are. This acceptance of the unexplained is a hallmark of the region, a recognition that the natural world has its own rules and its own moods. The story of the 1990s survey team is just one chapter in a much larger book of the Olympic interior, a book that is still being written by anyone brave or foolish enough to wander into the silence of the gray forest. As we look back on the timeline of these events, the escalation is clear. It began with a feeling, moved to a sound, transitioned into a distortion of time, and ended with a physical manipulation of the environment. This progression suggests a process of acclimatization, as if the environment was slowly tuning itself to the frequency of the human observers. If the team had stayed another week, it is impossible to know what the next stage would have been. Would the visual sightings have become more solid? Would the missing time have stretched into days or weeks? The decision to leave was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of self-preservation. They left because they realized they were losing the ability to distinguish between what was happening around them and what was happening within them. The final report from the lead researcher concluded with a surprisingly candid remark for a government document. He wrote that while the mission was a success in terms of data collection, he recommended that the specific sector be designated as a restricted area for future research. He didn't provide a scientific justification for this, but simply stated that the psychological toll on personnel was too high to justify further exploration. The recommendation was never officially adopted, but the sector remains largely ignored by the Forestry Service to this day. It is a place that has been effectively erased from the map by a consensus of silence. The mystery of the gray forest stands as a prominent example of how the real world can sometimes produce experiences that are more frightening than any fictional story. There are no jump scares here, no gore, and no clear villain. There is only the slow realization that the world we think we know is actually a very thin veneer over something much more complex and much more indifferent to our existence. The men of the survey team were not victims of a crime, but they were victims of a profound loss of certainty. They learned that the forest is not just a place we visit, it is a place that can visit us, changing our perception of time, sound, and reality itself. And once that change has happened, there is no going back to the way things were before. Today, the Olympic Peninsula remains a destination for millions of tourists who come to see its rugged beauty. They hike the trails, take photos of the moss-covered trees, and marvel at the scale of the landscape. Most of them never experience anything out of the ordinary. They stay on the path, they keep an eye on the time, and they return to their cars before dark. But for a few, the forest reveals its other side. They might notice the silence getting a bit too heavy, or they might hear a sound that doesn't belong. For them, the story of the 1990s survey team isn't just a piece of local history, it is a warning. It is a reminder that in the heart of the woods, there is a gray forest that is always watching, always breathing, and always waiting for someone to lose their way in its silent, timeless embrace. The details of the breathing and the silhouettes have been mirrored in other accounts across the border in Canada and further south in the Oregon wilderness, suggesting a broader phenomenon that spans the entire Pacific Northwest. Some researchers have suggested a link to infrasound produced by the interaction of wind and specific geological formations, which can cause hallucinations and physical discomfort. Others point to the possibility of unknown chemical compounds released by certain types of fungi in the deep woods. While these theories provide a comforting layer of scientific possibility, they fail to account for the shared nature of the experiences. When 5 different people see the same shadow and hear the same sound at the same time, the explanation must account for more than just an individual's brain chemistry. In the end, the story is left to the archives and the memories of the few who were there. It remains a definitive case of a real-world paranormal encounter that was documented by credible witnesses and never solved. It challenges our understanding of the environment and our place within it. The Olympic Peninsula is a vast and beautiful place, but it is also a place of deep shadows and unexplained silences. The next time you find yourself in the deep woods and the wind dies down and the birds stop singing, take a moment to listen. You might just hear the rhythmic breathing of the forest itself, reminding you that you are just a guest in a world that doesn't always play by your rules. The survey team members eventually moved on with their lives, but they were forever marked by those 3 weeks in the basin. One became a recluse, another changed careers entirely to work in urban planning, and the rest simply stopped going into the woods for recreation. The bond they formed was one of shared trauma and mutual understanding, a silent agreement never to fully explain what they felt during those missing hours. They knew that words would only diminish the reality of the experience. They had touched something that wasn't meant to be touched, and they had seen a side of the world that most people are lucky enough to never encounter. Their legacy is a reminder that the greatest horrors are often those that cannot be seen, but only felt in the weight of the air and the stillness of the trees. The story of the Gray Forest is not a ghost story in the traditional sense, but it is a story about the haunting power of the natural world. It is about the way a landscape can hold on to memories, or the way it can project a reality that is completely separate from our own. It is about the fragility of the human mind when faced with something it cannot categorize. As long as there are remote places on this earth, there will be stories like this. Stories of people who went into the wild and came back, changed not by what they saw, but by what they couldn't see. The Olympic interior remains a testament to that enduring mystery, a place where the gray blanket still falls and where the silence is never truly empty. The unseen presence at Point Lookout. The coastline along the northern tip of Stradbroke Island remains a place where the landscape often dictates the mood of those who traverse it. In the early 1950s, the area around Point Lookout was far more isolated than it is today, consisting mostly of rugged cliffs, dense scrub, and a few scattered dwellings that braved the salt spray and the isolation. Local families and visiting fishermen often spoke of the peculiar atmosphere that settled over the headlands when the sea mist rolled in, obscuring the horizon and muffling the sound of the crashing waves. It was during this period that a series of documented reports began to emerge regarding a specific stretch of the coastal path, where multiple individuals claimed to have encountered a presence that defied standard explanation. These witnesses were not looking for ghost stories. They were workers, locals, and travelers who found themselves caught in moments of profound, inexplicable dread. The first significant account involved a local surveyor named Thomas who was tasked with mapping the terrain near the North Gorge. It was a clear afternoon with high visibility, yet as Thomas worked near the edge of the cliffs, he reported a sudden and localized drop in temperature that felt entirely out of step with the subtropical climate. He described a sensation of being watched from the thickets of banksia trees that lined the ridge. When he turned to look, he saw nothing but the swaying branches, but the feeling of a heavy, breathing presence just behind his shoulder became so overwhelming that he was forced to stop his work. He later told acquaintances that it wasn't just a feeling of being observed, but a physical weight in the air that made it difficult to move his limbs with their usual coordination. He left his equipment and returned to the main settlement, refusing to go back to that specific coordinate until the following morning. As the weeks progressed, other reports began to filter through the small community. A group of fishermen who had set up camp near the same area reported a night of broken sleep and mounting anxiety. They claimed that while the fire was burning bright, the shadows cast against the rocks didn't seem to move in sync with the flames. One man specifically noted that a shadow appeared to detach itself from the rock face and stand motionless at the edge of their campsite. There was no sound of footsteps on the dry leaves and no rustle of clothing, yet every man in the group felt an instinctive urge to remain silent and still. They didn't speak to each other until the sun rose, at which point they discovered that none of them had actually seen a physical person, yet all of them had perceived the exact same dark shape standing in the same spot for nearly 4 hours. The phenomenon wasn't limited to nighttime encounters. A woman named Elizabeth, who lived in one of the few permanent cottages on the island, reported an incident during a midday walk along the cliffs. She was familiar with the local wildlife and the sounds of the bush, but on this particular day, she noted that all bird calls and insect noises suddenly ceased. The silence was so absolute it felt unnatural. As she continued along the path, she saw a figure dressed in dark, heavy clothing standing near the cliff edge. Thinking it was a hiker in distress, she called out to offer assistance. The figure did not turn or acknowledge her. As she approached within 20 feet, the figure seemed to blur at the edges, losing its definition against the blue of the ocean behind it. Elizabeth stopped in her tracks when she realized that she could see the horizon line directly through the torso of the individual. Within seconds, the shape dissipated like smoke, and the sound of the wind and birds returned instantly, as if a vacuum had been lifted. These incidents began to create a sense of unease among the residents of Point Lookout, leading some to look into the history of the land. There were no records of recent disappearances or violent crimes in that specific area that could provide a logical basis for a haunting. Instead, the report suggested a recurring environmental glitch or a residual presence that had no interest in communicating with the living. The witnesses often described a sense of profound sadness or ancient indifference emanating from the phenomenon. It wasn't an aggressive haunting in the traditional sense, but rather a series of intrusions by something that didn't belong to the current timeline. Some suggested that the unique geological composition of the island, with its massive sand dunes and underground freshwater aquifers, might be responsible for some kind of natural recording of past events, though this was purely speculative. By the mid-1950s, the frequency of these reports increased. A delivery driver who frequently moved supplies to the lighthouse keepers reported a strange distortion of time while driving the coastal track. He claimed he left the settlement at his usual time, a trip that normally took 20 minutes. He remembered seeing a tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the road near the North Gorge. He braked hard, expecting a collision, but the figure was gone before his truck came to a complete stop. When he checked his watch, upon arriving at the lighthouse, nearly 2 hours had passed that he could not account for. He had no memory of anything other than the figure in the road and the sudden realization that the sun was much lower in the sky than it should have been. His fuel gauge also showed significantly less petrol than it should have for such a short journey, suggesting the vehicle had been idling or driving for a much longer duration. The local authorities were eventually notified of these recurring complaints, though there was little they could do. Without a crime or a missing person, the reports were filed away as curiosities or the result of heat exhaustion and isolation. However, the consistency of the descriptions provided by unrelated witnesses was difficult to ignore. Almost everyone mentioned the same dark, heavy clothing, the same blurring of edges, and the same paralyzing sense of dread that preceded the sighting. One constable who took a statement from a distraught camper noted that the witness seemed genuinely traumatized, not by what the figure did, but by the sheer wrongness of its presence. The camper had described the figure as having no face, just a smooth, dark surface where features should be, which seemed to absorb the light around it. In 1957, a visiting researcher from the mainland who was interested in coastal erosion spent several nights camping near the site of the most frequent sightings. He kept a meticulous log of weather conditions, tide levels, and any unusual occurrences. On his third night, his notes became increasingly erratic. He wrote about a rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground, followed by the sensation of the air becoming thick and difficult to breathe. He described seeing a series of lights moving across the water that did not correspond to any known shipping lanes or aircraft. Most tellingly, he recorded an experience where he felt his own perception of his surroundings begin to fracture. He wrote that the cliffs looked like they were made of glass, and he could see figures moving deep within the stone. He left the island the next day, leaving his research unfinished and refusing to discuss his notes in detail with anyone. The phenomenon at Point Lookout never reached a definitive conclusion or a dramatic climax. Instead, as the island became more developed and the population grew, the sightings began to taper off. The construction of newer roads and the clearing of some of the denser scrub may have altered the environment in a way that disrupted whatever conditions allowed these experiences to occur. By the 1970s, the stories had largely transitioned into local folklore, told to tourists around campfires, but rarely experienced with the same intensity as they were in the 1950s. The dense, oppressive atmosphere that once defined the North Gorge seemed to lift, or perhaps the modern world simply became too loud for the subtle distortions to be noticed. There are still those who walk the coastal paths today and claim to feel a sudden, inexplicable chill or a sense of being followed when no one else is around. Some photographers have reported strange artifacts in their digital images, dark blurs or shadows that don't align with the light sources, but these are easily dismissed as lens flares or technical errors. The original witnesses, many of whom have since passed away, remained steadfast in their accounts until the end. They didn't look for fame or money. They were simply people who encountered something that sat outside the boundaries of their everyday lives. They spoke of a Point Lookout that was older and more mysterious than the tourist destination it eventually became, a place where the veil between the known and the unknown was thin enough to let something through. One of the last well-documented accounts from the original era came from a retired schoolteacher who had lived on the island for 30 years. She described an evening in the late 1960s when she was sitting on her porch overlooking the sea. She watched as a dark figure walked out from the trees and proceeded to walk straight off the edge of the cliff. She ran to the edge, expecting to see a body on the rocks below, but the beach was empty and there was no sign of any disturbance in the water. There were no footprints in the sand, despite the tide being out. She noted that the most disturbing part wasn't the fall, but the way the figure moved. It didn't have the gait of a human, but rather moved with a mechanical, sliding motion that suggested it wasn't interacting with the gravity of the earth in a normal way. The mystery of the Point Lookout presence remains one of the most compelling examples of a localized, non-criminal paranormal event. It lacks the hallmarks of a staged hoax, as the witnesses were diverse and had nothing to gain from their stories. The lack of a clear backstory or a specific ghost with a name and a grievance makes it even more unsettling. It suggests that there are places in the world where the environment itself holds on to something we don't understand, or where time doesn't always flow in a straight line. The incidents were never linked to any cult activity, pranksters, or natural gas leaks that could cause hallucinations. They were simply moments of high-tension reality that left those involved forever changed in their perception of the world. The archival records of these events serve as a reminder that the world is often stranger than we give it credit for. While we look for logical explanations for every shadow and every chill, some things remain stubbornly outside the reach of science and reason. The people who stood on those cliffs in the 1950s and saw the faceless figures or felt the missing hours didn't care about theories. They only knew that they had touched something that felt fundamentally alien to the human experience. The landscape of Stradbroke Island continues to shift with the wind and the waves, but the memory of those encounters stays locked in the old reports and the stories told by those who remember the silence of the North Gorge. Even in the present day, researchers of the unexplained occasionally visit the island, hoping to catch a glimpse of what the early residents described. They bring sensors and cameras, looking for electromagnetic fluctuations or temperature spikes. While they sometimes find minor anomalies, nothing has ever matched the sheer scale and frequency of the mid-century sightings. It is as if the phenomenon had a lifespan of its own, or perhaps it only manifests when the conditions of human isolation and natural wildness are perfectly balanced. The modern amenities of the island may have acted as a form of grounding, pushing the unexplained back into the deeper, unreachable parts of the scrub. If you talk to the older generations who still reside in the area, they might point to a specific bend in the path or a particular rock formation where the air still feels a little too heavy. They won't tell you it is haunted by a person, but they might tell you that the land there has a memory that hasn't quite faded. They describe it as a ripple in water that takes a long time to settle. The feeling of being watched, the sudden silence of the birds, and the distortion of the light remain the primary indicators of this lingering residue. It is a haunting of place, not of person, where the horror comes from the realization that we are not always the primary inhabitants of the spaces we occupy. The legacy of these events is a quiet one. There are no plaques or markers indicating where the most famous sightings occurred. The island is content to let its secrets be buried under layers of sand and time. Yet, for those who have read the old testimonies or heard the first-hand accounts, the cliffs of Point Lookout will always carry a different weight. They represent a window into a period where the unexplained was a part of daily life for a few unfortunate witnesses, a time when the darkness at the edge of the campsite was something to be respected and feared. The faceless figure of the 1950s remains one of Australia's most enduring and least understood mysteries, a silent sentinel in the history of the island's rugged coast. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the North Gorge, it is easy to see how the mind might play tricks. But for Thomas the surveyor, Elizabeth the resident, and the unnamed campers of the 1950s, it wasn't a trick. It was a physical, palpable reality that challenged their understanding of the natural world. They lived through a series of events that lacked a climax or a resolution, which in many ways is more disturbing than a story with an ending. The unresolved nature of the Point Lookout incidents ensures that the phenomenon remains a subject of quiet fascination, a reminder that some things in this world are meant to remain unexplained, existing in the periphery of our vision and the gaps in our records. The sheer volume of consistent data from that era suggests that whatever was happening at Point Lookout was a sustained event. It wasn't a one-off sighting or a localized legend. It was a decade of high-frequency anomalies that centered on a very specific geographical coordinate. Whether it was a rift in time, a sensory echo of a past event, or something entirely outside our current classification of the paranormal, its impact on the local culture was profound. It shaped the way people interacted with the landscape, instilling a sense of caution that persists in the way locals talk about the cliffs after dark. They don't talk about ghosts, they talk about the atmosphere, the weight, and the silence. Ultimately, the story of Point Lookout is a story about the limits of human perception. We are built to recognize patterns and find causes, but the witnesses on Stradbroke Island found neither. They were left with nothing but the memory of a shadow that didn't move right and a silence that felt like a scream. The events remain a significant part of the region's hidden history, a collection of moments where the ordinary world was interrupted by something vast and indifferent. The fact that it stopped, or at least faded from view, provides little comfort to those who know the details of the reports. It only leaves the question of when the conditions might become right for the presence to return to the cliffs once more. Today, the North Gorge is a popular spot for whale watching and scenic walks. Thousands of people pass through the area every year, most of them completely unaware of the history of the ground they walk on. They take photos of the same cliffs where Elizabeth saw a man turn to smoke and where Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder in the empty bush. The beauty of the location masks its eerie past, providing a veneer of safety and normalcy. But for the researcher who digs through the old archives, or the local who listens to the stories of their grandparents, the beauty of Point Lookout is always tempered by the knowledge of what might be standing just out of sight, waiting for the mist to roll in and the birds to go silent. The persistence of the Point Lookout reports, even in their diminished modern form, highlights the human need to document the strange. Even when there is no logical framework to support what is being seen, the act of reporting it becomes a way to process the trauma of the unexplained. The 1950s accounts were recorded with a clinical, matter-of-fact tone that makes them even more chilling. These weren't people prone to flights of fancy. They were practical, hard-working individuals who were confronted with something that simply should not have been there. Their testimonies stand as a collective witness to a decade of strangeness that defined a generation's relationship with the island. In the end, we are left with a series of questions that may never be answered. Was there a specific event in the distant past that triggered these manifestations? Is there something about the magnetic field of the island that creates sensory distortions? Or is it possible that certain places on Earth act as crossroads for things we cannot see? The Point Lookout presence remains an enigma, a shadow on the history of the Australian coast that refuses to be fully explained or forgotten. It serves as a stark reminder that even in a world mapped and explored, there are still pockets of the unknown that wait for a solitary walker to turn a corner and find themselves in a silence that shouldn't exist. The narrative of this coastal mystery is built on the quietest details, the sound of a footfall that isn't there, the sight of a horizon through a human shape, and the feeling of hours slipping away like water. These are the elements that stayed with the witnesses for the rest of their lives. They didn't tell stories of monsters, they told stories of a world that briefly stopped making sense. And as the waves continue to batter the rocks at the North Gorge, the island holds on to those moments, keeping them safe in the salt air and the shifting sands, a permanent part of the landscape that most will never see, but some will never forget. The final records from the late 1950s show a community that had grown weary of the strangeness. The reports became shorter, less detailed, as if the people had accepted the presence as just another hazard of the island, like the riptides or the summer storms. This normalization of the paranormal is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the case. It suggests that humans can adapt to almost anything, even the presence of a faceless figure standing on a cliff edge. The mystery didn't go away because it was solved. It went away because the world moved on, leaving the shadows of Point Lookout to find their own peace in the isolation of the coast. As we look back at the documented history of this period, the consistency across the decades remains the most striking feature. From the first surveyor in the early 50s to the retired teacher in the late 60s, the descriptions of the figure and the environmental changes remained virtually identical. This suggests a stable phenomenon rather than a series of disconnected hallucinations. It was a singular, recurring event that focused its energy on a specific patch of Earth. While we may never know what it was, the records provide a clear and unsettling picture of what it felt like to encounter it. Point Lookout remains a place of great natural beauty, but for those who know its history, that beauty will always be shadowed by the memory of the presence that once claimed the cliffs as its own. The story concludes not with a revelation, but with the same ambiguity that defined the events themselves. The presence at Point Lookout didn't leave a message or a warning. It didn't change the course of history or reveal great truths. It simply existed, a brief and terrifying intersection between the known and the unknown. Its legacy is found in the hushed tones of local stories and the yellowing pages of old reports, a reminder that the most disturbing things are often the ones that have no explanation and no purpose, existing simply because the world is far more complex than we can imagine. The island's topography, dominated by its massive sand dunes and the vastness of the Pacific, provides the perfect backdrop for such a lingering mystery. The sand itself is a shifting, ancient medium capable of burying secrets for centuries. Some believe that the very ground at Point Lookout acts as a vessel for these echoes, and that the events of the 1950s were simply a period where the vessel overflowed. Whether that is true or not, the impact on those who experienced it was very real. They walked away from those cliffs with a new understanding of the dark, a sense that the shadows aren't always empty, and that the silence of the bush isn't always peaceful. As the modern era continues to encroach upon the wild spaces of Australia, cases like the Point Lookout presence become even more significant. They represent the last vestiges of a time when the land was still capable of surprising us, of presenting us with something that we couldn't categorize or control. The faceless figure in the dark clothing remains a symbol of that era, a silent, blurring shape on the edge of the world, reminding us to be careful when we call out into the mist, because we might not like what doesn't answer back. The archival search for similar incidents along the coast has yielded few results that match the intensity of Point Lookout. Other islands have their legends, and other headlands have their ghost stories, but none possess the same clinical documentation of a recurring, non-criminal environmental disturbance. This uniqueness makes the case a cornerstone of Australian paranormal research, even if it remains out of the mainstream spotlight. It is a local mystery that has stayed local, preserved by the people who live there and the archives that keep their secrets. In closing, the events at Point Lookout during the 1950s stand as a testament to the power of place. The cliffs, the gorge, and the sea created a stage for something that defied the laws of the everyday. The witnesses were the unwilling audience, left to interpret a performance that had no script and no end. Their stories remain as a shadow on the landscape, a chilling reminder that some parts of the world are still governed by rules we haven't learned yet, and that the most frightening things are often the ones that stand perfectly still and say nothing at all. The final analysis of the witness accounts suggests that the dread was the most consistent symptom of the encounter. It was a biological response to an external stimulus that the human brain couldn't process. When the fishermen saw the shadow detach from the rock, or when Elizabeth saw the horizon through a man's chest, their bodies responded with a primal fear that bypassed logic. This fear is what links all the stories together, creating a narrative of a decade-long haunting that left a permanent mark on the psyche of a small island community. The presence may be gone, or it may simply be waiting for the world to become quiet enough for it to be seen again. Would you like me to investigate another lesser-known paranormal incident from the 20th century, perhaps focusing on the survival situations in the Canadian wilderness? The fire spook of Caledonia Mills. The winter of 1,922 inches, Antigonish County, Nova Scotia, was defined by a silence that felt heavy and suffocating to those who lived in the remote highlands. This region of eastern Canada was characterized by rolling hills, dense spruce forests, and a population of farmers who lived miles apart from one another, connected only by frozen dirt roads and a shared reliance on the land. In the community of Caledonia Mills, the isolation was particularly acute. The farms were scattered, and during the deep freeze of January, a household could go days without seeing another soul. It was in this setting of extreme seclusion and environmental hardship that the McDonald farm became the center of a series of events that would baffle local authorities, terrify the community, and leave a documented record of phenomena that resisted all conventional explanation. The farm belonged to Alexander McDonald, an elderly man known locally for his quiet demeanor and devout nature. He lived there with his wife and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen, who was 16 years old at the time. The events that unfolded over a period of 2 weeks in January did not begin with a sudden explosion of activity, but rather with a creeping sense of unease that permeated the daily routine of the household. The initial disturbances were subtle enough that the family questioned their own perceptions. It began with sounds that had no discernible source. In the quiet of the evening, when the wind was still and the only noise should have been the settling of the timber frame, the family reported hearing heavy footsteps pacing in the empty attic above them. Alexander, a man accustomed to the natural sounds of an old house, initially dismissed these noises as the groaning of wood under the stress of the dropping temperatures. However, the sounds grew more distinct and rhythmic, mimicking the gait of a grown man walking with purpose across the floorboards. Checks of the attic revealed nothing but dust and stored belongings, undisturbed and cold. This auditory phenomenon persisted for several nights, creating an atmosphere of tension in the home, but it was merely a precursor to the physical manifestations that would soon disrupt their lives entirely. The shift from sound to physical displacement occurred rapidly. Objects in the kitchen, specifically heavy iron pots and ceramic dishes, began to move without human intervention. These were not the subtle shifts caused by vibration, but significant relocations where items were found on the floor or on different surfaces than where they had been placed moments before. The escalation to the most dangerous and well-documented phase of the haunting began on a Saturday morning in mid-January. The family was engaged in their morning chores when the smell of smoke drifted through the main hallway. In a wooden farmhouse heated by wood stoves and lit by kerosene lamps, fire was a constant and terrifying threat, and the family reacted with immediate panic. They searched the house frantically, expecting to find a chimney fire or a dropped ember. Instead, they discovered small, isolated flames erupting in locations that defied the laws of physics and combustion. The first fire was found on a piece of wallpaper in the unused parlor. There was no stove in the room, no lamp had been lit, and no one had entered the space for hours. The fire was small, consuming the paper in a slow, deliberate burn that seemed to lack a clear ignition source. Alexander extinguished it with his hands, leaving a scorched patch on the wall. Before the family could process what had happened, a second cry of alarm came from the kitchen. In the kitchen, a dish towel that had been hanging on a rack, damp from recent use, had burst into flames. The fire was bright and hot, consuming the fabric rapidly despite its moisture. There was no spark, no nearby flame, and no chemical accelerant present. The family beat the flames out, leaving the room filled with the acrid smell of burnt cotton. This marked the beginning of a siege that would last for nearly 2 weeks. The fires were not random accidents, but appeared to be intelligent, targeting specific flammable materials in a way that suggested a deliberate intent to harass and terrify. Throughout that first day, the McDonald's extinguished over a dozen separate fires. They occurred in curtains, in piles of clothing, and even in the wood of the walls themselves. The most disturbing aspect was the lack of heat radiating from the start of the combustion. Witnesses later described the fires as springing into existence, fully formed, often in corners of the room where no person was standing. The family, exhausted and fearful, set up a rotation to watch the rooms, but the fires seemed to anticipate their movements, breaking out in rooms the moment they were vacated. Word of the disturbances traveled slowly due to the weather and the isolation, but eventually neighbors were summoned to help. The arrival of outside witnesses provided the first objective corroboration of the events. Neighbors who came to assist the McDonald's found themselves thrust into a chaotic environment where the laws of nature seemed suspended. One neighbor, a man named McGillivray, reported standing in the center of the kitchen and watching as a blue flame materialized on the surface of a wooden table. He described it as a flash of light followed instantly by combustion. There was no sound of a match being struck, and no one was close enough to the table to have set it. This testimony was crucial because it removed the possibility that the family was hallucinating or that the fires were the result of a single person's sleight of hand. The witnesses were diligent, sober farmers who were skeptical by nature, yet they found themselves fighting a phenomenon they could not explain. They formed bucket brigades, keeping water and sand ready in every room, turning the farmhouse into a fortress against an invisible arsonist. As the days passed, the nature of the phenomena grew more aggressive and bizarre. The fires began to occur in places that were technically impossible. A basket of wet laundry, freshly pulled from the wash basin and heavy with water, was found smoldering in the corner of the pantry. When the neighbors rushed to put it out, they found that the clothes inside were burning with a fierce intensity, despite being soaked. In another instance, a fire broke out inside a closed dresser drawer. The smoke seeping from the cracks was the only warning. When Alexander pulled the drawer open, flames shot up from a stack of folded linens. The fire had started in the center of the stack, shielded from the air, and had burned outward. This internal combustion terrified the witnesses, as it implied that no place in the house was safe. The psychological toll on Alexander MacDonald was visible to everyone. He was a man watching his life's work and his sanctuary being dismantled by a force he could not fight. He stopped sleeping, spending his nights patrolling the hallways with a lantern, his eyes scanning the shadows for the next spark. The phenomena were not limited to the house. The barn, a critical structure for the survival of the farm's livestock during the winter, became a secondary theater for the disturbances. Alexander reported that the cattle were behaving erratically, often found trembling and refusing to enter their stalls. Upon investigation, he discovered that the tails of the cows and horses had been braided together in intricate knots. These were not simple tangles caused by movement, but complex weaves that would have taken a human hand considerable time to execute. The animals were skittish, reacting to unseen stimuli, often kicking at the empty air or bolting against the wooden enclosures. In one instance, a heavy weaving loom stored in an outbuilding was found dismantled, its heavy wooden beams scattered across the floor. The force required to take apart the loom was significant, yet no noise had been heard from the building. These events outside the main house suggested that the presence was not bound to the interior walls, but was attached to the property or the family itself. The intensity of the fires drew the attention of the broader region, and soon, reports began to appear in local newspapers. These reports attracted the curious and the skeptical, including a local journalist named Harold Whidden. Whidden arrived at the farm expecting to expose a hoax or identify a natural cause, such as a chemical leak or faulty wiring. However, the farmhouse had no electricity, and the structure was simple timber and plaster. Whidden became a first-hand witness to the events he had come to investigate. During his time at the house, he observed the spontaneous ignition of a window shade. He was standing only a few feet away, talking to Alexander, when the fabric simply dissolved into flame. He noted in his accounts that he had a clear view of everyone in the room and that no one had moved toward the window. The fire was extinguished quickly, but the impression it left on the journalist was profound. He wrote of the palpable tension in the house, a sense of heavy anticipation that preceded each event, described by the family as a change in the air pressure or a sudden drop in temperature. Suspicions inevitably turned toward the members of the household, as is common in such cases. Mary Ellen, the adopted daughter, became a focal point for those looking for a human agent. It was noted that she was often present in the house when the fires started, though rarely in the immediate vicinity of the flames. In the theory of poltergeist phenomena, adolescents are often cited as unwitting epicenters for the activity, sometimes referred to as agents of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. However, in Caledonia Mills, the timeline and logistics made it difficult to pin the blame solely on the girl. Witnesses reported fires starting in the attic while Mary Ellen was in the kitchen or in the barn while she was under observation in the parlor. During one vigil, she was seated between two neighbors, her hands visible, when a fire erupted in a bedroom on the floor above. The sound of the flames crackling was heard before the smoke was seen, and the men rushed upstairs to find the bedclothes ablaze. Mary Ellen had not moved from her chair. The situation at the farm became untenable as the physical danger increased. The sheer number of fires, totaling nearly 40 distinct ignitions over the 2-week period, meant that the structure was constantly at risk of burning to the ground with the family inside. The exhaustion of the family and the volunteers reached a breaking point. Alexander MacDonald, a man of deep faith, eventually sought the assistance of the clergy, but the interventions offered little relief. The fires continued with relentless consistency. One particularly harrowing evening saw 5 separate fires break out within an hour. One started on a bookshelf, burning through a stack of almanacs. Another started in a pile of kindling by the stove, which was expected. But a third started in the very clothes Alexander was wearing. He felt a sudden heat on his back and realized his coat was smoldering. He tore the garment off and threw it into the snow, where it continued to smoke. This direct assault on his person broke his resolve. He felt that the entity, whatever it was no longer just targeting the house, but was turning its aggression toward him. The decision was made to abandon the farm. It was a choice made out of desperation and the primal instinct for survival. In the depth of winter, leaving a homestead was a significant undertaking, but the family felt they had no alternative. They packed what essentials they could carry, fearing that anything they took might carry the infection of the haunting with it. They moved into a neighbor's home temporarily, leaving the MacDonald farmhouse standing dark and empty in the snow. Interestingly, once the family vacated the premises, the fires ceased. The house did not burn down in their absence. It stood silent, the scorched walls and water-damaged floors, the only evidence of the chaos that had ensued. This cessation of activity upon their departure strongly suggested that the phenomenon was linked to the presence of the family rather than the location itself, yet the house retained a reputation of malevolence that kept locals away for years. Following the abandonment, the case attracted the attention of Dr. Plass, Walter Franklin Prince, a renowned researcher from the American Society for Psychical Research. Prince was a meticulous investigator who had handled high-profile cases across North America. He traveled to Nova Scotia to interview the witnesses and examine the site. His investigation was thorough. He collected sworn affidavits from the neighbors who had put out the fires, from the journalist Whidden, and from the MacDonald family. Prince examined the burn marks, noting their peculiar patterns and the lack of accelerants. He famously concluded that the case was one of the very best authenticated cases of poltergeist phenomena on record. His report highlighted the impossibility of human agency in many of the specific incidents, particularly those where multiple independent witnesses had eyes on all family members when fires erupted in distant rooms. Prince's involvement lent a degree of historical weight to the case, preserving the details in the archives of psychical research, yet he could offer no definitive explanation for the source of the energy. The aftermath of the haunting left the MacDonald family fractured. They never returned to live in the farmhouse at Caledonia Mills. The stigma of the event followed them, and the community viewed them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Mary Ellen, in particular, lived under the shadow of the events. While never charged with any crime, police and fire officials could find no evidence of arson and no means by which she could have set the fires. She was often whispered about as the fire starter or the witch of Caledonia Mills. The psychological impact on a young woman in a rural, superstitious community was severe. She was subjected to scrutiny that lasted for the rest of her life. The farm itself eventually fell into ruin. For decades, the shell of the house remained standing, a local curiosity that teenagers would dare each other to approach, but few would enter. The scorched wallpaper and the charred floorboards remained as silent testaments to the weeks in January 1922 when the laws of thermodynamics seemed to unravel. One of the most enduring mysteries of the case was the specific nature of the blue flash described by the neighbor McGillivray. This detail appears in multiple accounts and aligns with other historical reports of poltergeist activity where witnesses describe luminous phenomena preceding physical disturbances. In the context of 1922 rural Canada, there was no technology available to the MacDonalds that could produce such an effect. Flashlights were primitive, and electrical grids did not reach their farm. The blue light suggests an ionization of the air or a plasma-like discharge, concepts that were alien to the farmers who witnessed them. They lacked the vocabulary to describe what they were seeing, often resorting to terms like spirit lights or hellfire. This specific detail lends credibility to the account because it is a bizarre, specific observation that an uneducated farmer would be unlikely to invent when trying to describe a simple fire. The Caledonia Mills case remains one of the most significant yet overlooked episodes in Canadian paranormal history. It lacks the cinematic narrative of a haunted house where ghosts appear in mirrors or voices scream in the night. Instead, it was a haunting of physics, of heat, displacement, and silence. It was a terrifying ordeal of survival against an element that turned against the residents. The fire, usually the farmer's friend against the bitter cold, became the predator. The image of the family and their neighbors standing in the freezing snow, watching smoke curl from the eaves of a house that was trying to destroy itself from the inside, captures the essence of the horror. It was a violation of the domestic sanctuary, an intrusion that offered no communication, no demands, and no resolution. Attempts to debunk the story have always hit the wall of the sheer number of witnesses. To dismiss the Caledonia Mills fires as a hoax requires one to believe that a quiet, elderly religious couple and their young daughter conspired to destroy their own home and livelihood in the middle of winter, and that they managed to fool dozens of their neighbors, the local police, and a cynical journalist while doing so. It requires assuming that they could set fires inside closed drawers and wet laundry without being detected by people standing inches away. The logistical complexity of faking such a phenomenon, particularly the simultaneous fires in different rooms, argues against the hoax theory. Furthermore, the family gained nothing from the events. They lost their home, their standing in the community, and their peace of mind. There was no financial gain, no book deal, and no fame sought. They simply fled to survive. The final records of the incident are kept in the archives of the Historical Societies of Nova Scotia and the files of the psychical research organizations that took an interest. They tell the story of a battle fought in a farmhouse kitchen with buckets of water and sand against an enemy that could not be seen or touched. The timeline of the events shows a clear beginning, a violent escalation, and an abrupt end that coincided with the family's departure. This pattern is consistent with the profile of poltergeist activity, which is often transient and person-centered. However, for the people of Caledonia Mills, it was not a scientific anomaly, but a terrifying reality. The story passed down through generations is not one of ghosts in sheets, but of the smell of burning wool, the biting cold of the January night, and the fear of the next blue flash. Even today, the location where the farm stood holds a certain notoriety in the local folklore. The forest has largely reclaimed the land, and the physical evidence has rotted away into the earth. But the accounts remain written in the sober, straightforward language of the 1920s rural population. These were people who understood the dangers of fire intimately, who knew how wood burned and how smoke moved. Their insistence that these fires were unnatural carries a weight that is hard to dismiss. They did not use the language of the supernatural lightly. When they said a fire started from nothing, they meant that they had exhausted every natural possibility and found the void staring back at them. The fire spook of Caledonia Mills stands as a testament to the strange and terrifying possibilities that exist on the fringes of the known world, in the quiet, dark places where isolation allows the impossible to take root.